What if the song you've played your whole life, the one everyone laughed at, suddenly became the music the whole world couldn't stop listening to? What if the producer who mocked you was forced to watch as your music took over the charts? Daniel Cruz was just an old musician with a guitar, but when his song went viral, the industry had no choice but to listen. Stay with us to hear the story of how true music never dies. Like and subscribe for more inspiring stories. The warm evening sun cast a golden glow over New Orleans, its light dancing off the brick buildings and narrow streets. The air carried a familiar mix of jazz and the distant hum of conversation, blending together like an old song. Daniel Cruz sat in the corner of his small shop, Cruz's Music and Heritage, carefully tuning a vintage guitar. It wasn't a fancy shop, just a modest space lined with wooden shelves, filled with guitars, Killintang sets, and brass horns. Posters of legendary musicians, from Louis Armstrong to his own grandfather, Manuel Cruz, decorated the walls. This shop was more than just a business. It was Daniel's way of preserving a piece of history. As he plucked a few notes, his fingers tracing a melody passed down through generations, he thought back to the lessons his grandfather used to teach him. Music isn't about noise, Hijo. It's about the soul. That was a lesson Daniel never forgot, but the world was different now. People didn't seem to care about history, about where music came from. They wanted fast beats, catchy hooks, and radio-ready sounds, and that's why the letter sitting on his counter surprised him. Daniel picked up the envelope again, staring at the bold Pulse Records logo in the corner. It was one of the biggest music labels in the country, producing platinum-selling artists left and right. He knew of it, of course. Who didn't? But what did they want with him? The letter was simple. We invite you to Pulse Records for an exclusive opportunity to discuss the future of music. There was a signature at the bottom, Ethan Blackwell. Daniel had heard the name. Ethan was a rising power in the music industry, a producer with a reputation for shaping hits and an ego even bigger than his success. He was young, wealthy, and ruthless when it came to business. Exclusive opportunity, Daniel muttered, shaking his head. It didn't make sense, but his curiosity won out over his skepticism. Maybe, just maybe, someone in that corporate jungle still cared about real music. The next morning, he grabbed his grandfather's old guitar, threw on his best button-down shirt, and headed out. Walking into Pulse Records felt like stepping onto another planet. The lobby alone was bigger than his entire shop. Glass walls, sleek furniture, and massive LED screens playing the latest chart-topping hits filled the space. Young artists, dressed in designer clothes and expensive sneakers, lounged on leather couches, scrolling through their phones. Daniel adjusted the strap on his guitar case. He had never felt more out of place. A young woman at the reception desk gave him a quick glance. "Can I help you?" she asked, barely looking up from her computer. "I have a meeting," Daniel said, holding up the invitation. She raised an eyebrow but checked the system. After a few clicks, her expression changed slightly, maybe a bit of surprise, maybe confusion. "Fourth floor, Studio B. Mr. Blackwell will see you soon." Daniel nodded and made his way to the elevators. As the doors closed, he took a deep breath. "What am I doing here?" When Daniel stepped into Studio B, he was greeted by the sound of laughter. A group of young producers and artists were gathered around a soundboard, sipping coffee, nodding along to a bass-heavy beat blasting from the speakers. In the center of it all stood Ethan Blackwell, tall, sharp-featured, wearing a sleek, tailored suit that probably cost more than Daniel's entire shop. Ethan turned, his eyes scanning Daniel from head to toe before smirking. "And who let Grandpa in?" The room erupted in chuckles. A few of the younger producers exchanged amused glances. Daniel didn't react. He had been around long enough to know when people wanted to push buttons. "Daniel Cruz," he said, stepping forward. His voice was calm, steady. "I believe you invited me." Ethan gave a theatrical shrug. "I did. Thought it'd be fun to see an old-school musician up close. You know, for research. More laughter. Daniel remained unfazed. He had been through worse, seen tougher rooms than this. He simply set his guitar case down and met Ethan's gaze. "So," he said, his voice smooth and controlled, "what exactly do you want to talk about?" Ethan walked around the room, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "Here's the thing, Mr. Cruz," he began, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Music today is about innovation, trends, evolution." He gestured to the massive speakers. "We create beats that get billions of streams. We shape pop culture. We make people feel something: excitement, power, confidence. That's what modern music is." He turned back to Daniel, arms crossed. "And then we have this." He motioned toward Daniel's guitar case. An old man carrying an even older instrument, playing songs that nobody listens to anymore. Silence settled in the room. Some of the younger producers shifted uncomfortably. Daniel exhaled slowly, then knelt down and unzipped his guitar case. The studio lights reflected off the worn wood, the history etched into every scratch and dent. "This guitar," he said softly, running his fingers along the strings, "has played in bars, on porches, in homes where people laughed, cried, danced." He looked around the room, locking eyes with Ethan. "It's played music that wasn't just meant to be heard, it was meant to be felt." A few people in the room stopped smiling. Even Ethan's smirk wavered for a second, but then he scoffed. "That's cute," he said. "Really. But let's be real, old man. Nobody's sitting around crying over some ancient lullaby. People want hype. They want music they can put on in their cars, in the clubs. They don't want history lessons." Daniel chuckled softly. "True music doesn't belong to trends, son. It belongs to the heart." Ethan rolled his eyes. Yeah, well, heart doesn't sell records." He snapped his fingers and a security guard appeared at the door. "We're done here. Thanks for stopping by, Mr. Cruz. But Pulse Records is looking toward the future, not the past." Daniel stood up slowly, his movements calm and deliberate. He picked up his guitar case, slinging it over his shoulder like an old friend. He looked around the room once more, at the young producers, the expensive equipment, the flashing lights. Then he met Ethan's gaze one last time. "Thank you for your time," he said. No anger. No bitterness. Just quiet certainty. And with that, he turned and walked out. What none of them realized was that, at that very moment, something incredible was already beginning to unfold. A few feet away, standing near the doorway, Lily Moore clutched her phone, a phone that had been secretly recording Daniel's performance the whole time. And soon, the world would hear the song that Ethan Blackwell had just laughed at. Daniel Cruz sat in the quiet comfort of his small music shop, the scent of aged wood and polished brass lingering in the air. Outside, New Orleans carried on as it always did. Street musicians played along Frenchman Street, blending jazz, blues, and brass band sounds into a never-ending melody. But Daniel wasn't paying attention to the city tonight. He was focused on his guitar. After what had happened at Pulse Records, a part of him felt like he should just move on, forget about the whole thing. Ethan Blackwell and his smug laughter had made it clear. There was no place for music like his in today's industry. But then there was the girl in the corner, the intern, Lily Moore. She had been tapping her foot, nodding along, her eyes wide with something close to awe. That meant something. It meant that somewhere, someone was still listening. And that was enough for him to pick up his grandfather's guitar and start playing. Daniel plucked out a few notes, letting them settle into the warm air of his shop. A slow, bluesy hum, mixed with something deeper, something older. His grandfather's voice echoed in his mind. "The Kilintang is the rhythm of our ancestors. The guitar is the voice of the present. Blend them, Daniel, and let the past and future dance together." So he did. He started with a Kilintang-inspired rhythm, using the body of his guitar as a drum, tapping out a beat that felt ancient and alive. Then he let the jazz-infused chords weave into it, layering in the kind of melodies that New Orleans had carried for generations. It wasn't just music. It was a conversation between his Filipino heritage and the streets he grew up on. And when he finally sang, his voice was low, rich, full of the stories his grandfather used to tell. By the time he played the final note, his hands trembled slightly. He knew what he had just created, something real, something alive. "Damn," he muttered to himself, leaning back. This was the song. This was the one. What Daniel didn't know was that he wasn't alone. Across town, sitting in her tiny apartment, Lily Moore had her phone in her hands, rewatching the video she had secretly recorded. She had been replaying it over and over, the melody running through her mind like a whisper she couldn't ignore. Lily had always loved music, which was why she had fought so hard to get an internship at Pulse Records. But after months of watching producers obsess over catchy beats and soulless hooks, she had started to feel like the industry was missing something. Then Daniel had walked in, with nothing but his old guitar and a song that felt like it had lived 1,000 lives. She knew Ethan had dismissed him. She knew that the label would never give a song like this a chance. But she also knew something else. People need to hear this. Lily bit her lip, hesitating. Then, slowly, she clicked upload. The next morning, Daniel was tuning a young student's guitar when his shop phone rang. "Cruz's Music and Heritage," he answered, expecting it to be one of his regulars. "Mr. Cruz, this is Richard Carter from Pulse Records. We'd like to speak with you about a potential contract." Daniel frowned. Pulse Records. His first instinct was to hang up. Ethan had made it painfully clear that they had no interest in his music. So what had changed? "What kind of contract?" he asked carefully. "Mr. Blackwell was impressed with your style. We think there might be something there, something marketable." That word, marketable, it made Daniel's stomach tighten. Still, curiosity got the best of him. "I'll be there in an hour." When Daniel stepped into Pulse Records again, the atmosphere felt different. For one, Ethan wasn't alone this time. He had a team of producers, lawyers, and marketing experts sitting behind him, all watching Daniel with the same kind of curious, calculating looks. Ethan leaned forward. "Daniel, I'll be honest with you. After giving your song a second listen, I see potential. There's something different about it, something we could work with." Daniel didn't reply, he just waited. Ethan sighed as if he was doing Daniel a favor. "We're willing to sign you." Silence. Then Daniel tilted his head slightly. "And what's the catch?" Ethan grinned like a cat about to play with a mouse. "No catch, just a few minor adjustments." Daniel already knew where this was going. "We'd need to strip out some of the traditional elements," one of the producers chimed in. "The Killintang rhythm is cool, but we'd replace it with a stronger bass line. And the guitar, we can keep it, but we'll layer it under a few synths, make it more radio-friendly." Another producer nodded. "And we'd tweak your lyrics, modernize them. Maybe get a younger artist to sing on the track as well, give it wider appeal." Daniel's expression didn't change, but inside his heart ached. They didn't want his song. They wanted to gut it, hollow it out, turn it into just another manufactured track. He took a deep breath. "No." The room went still. Ethan blinked. "Excuse me." Daniel met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "The song stays the way it is." Ethan laughed, loud and sharp. "Daniel, come on, be realistic. No one is going to listen to a track like this in 2024. You're holding on to something outdated. Let us shape it into something people actually want." Daniel picked up his guitar case, slinging it over his shoulder. "People don't know what they want until they hear it," he said softly. Ethan smirked. "Then I guess no one will ever hear your music." Daniel didn't argue. He just turned and walked out. What Ethan didn't know was that the world was already listening. That night, Lily sat in her room staring at her phone in shock. The video she had uploaded, Daniel's raw, unfiltered performance, had started gaining traction. Hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands of views. People weren't just listening. They were feeling, and they were sharing it. "Where can I find more of his music?" This is the most soulful thing I've heard in years. Who is this man? Why isn't he famous? As Lily watched the numbers climb, she realized something incredible was happening. Daniel Cruz didn't need Pulse Records, because the world was about to hear his song just the way he wrote it. It started with a whisper, a quiet hum on the internet, a ripple that barely caught attention. Then overnight, that whisper became a roar. Lily Moore hadn't expected much when she uploaded the video. She just wanted people to hear Daniel's music, to feel what she had felt when she first heard it in the studio. But by the next morning, the video had racked up 50,000 views. By lunch, it had 250,000. By midnight, it was in the millions. People weren't just listening, they were reacting. This is the most soulful thing I've heard in years. How can something sound both ancient and fresh at the same time? This song has history in it. You can feel it in your bones. It was spreading across continents. Musicians in Japan added soft flute melodies. A DJ in South Korea remixed it with electronic beats. A guitarist in Spain played a flamenco-inspired version. Each one added their own touch, but the heart of the song remained untouched. Daniel's raw, aching voice, his steady guitar, and the Kilintang rhythm beating like a pulse through it all. And then something truly unexpected happened. In the heart of Los Angeles, in an arena filled with over 50,000 screaming fans, the lights dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd as the screen behind the stage flickered to life. At first, it was just a still image, an old man sitting in a tiny music shop, a guitar resting in his lap. Then the first chords of Daniel's song played, raw and untouched, through the massive speakers. And when the spotlight hit center stage, standing there, holding an acoustic guitar, was one of the biggest R&B singers in the world, Layla Carter. She strummed the opening chords, her voice hushed, reverent. "I heard this song a week ago," she said into the microphone, her voice trembling with emotion. "And it reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place. Real music, honest music, music that makes you stop and feel something. This is the song the world needs right now." Then she sang. Her voice, powerful yet delicate, wove into Daniel's melody, lifting it to new heights. By the time she reached the chorus, the entire crowd was singing along, even though most of them had never heard the song before. It was a moment, a once-in-a-lifetime moment that no marketing team, no big-budget campaign, no polished studio production could have ever manufactured. And it was all because one old musician refused to change his song. The next morning, Ethan Blackwell woke up to chaos. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. His inbox was flooded. His name was trending on Twitter for all the wrong reasons. News outlets were already running headlines. Daniel Cruz's song becomes a global phenomenon. How one man's music brought the world together. Industry veteran Ethan Blackwell mocked the song that's now won. Justice for Daniel was trending. People were digging up the recording of Ethan's insults, the way he had dismissed Daniel as an old man playing outdated lullabies. They weren't happy. And now, Pulse Records was feeling the heat. Radio stations were calling, demanding to know when they could get an official release of the song. Streaming platforms were flooded with requests. The problem? Pulse Records didn't own the song. Ethan didn't own the song. Daniel Cruz did. And for the first time in his career, Ethan Blackwell realized he was on the wrong side of history. Within 24 hours of Layla Carter's performance, the song had skyrocketed to 1 on Spotify's global viral chart. Within 48 hours, it had over 20 million streams. Musicians everywhere started covering it, remixing it, blending it with their own cultural sounds. A group of indigenous singers in Canada added their own drumming and harmonies. A choir in South Africa created a gospel rendition. A hip-hop producer in New York mixed it with boom-bap beats, making it a crossover hit. And in the middle of it all, Daniel Cruz sat in his tiny shop, completely unaware of what was happening. Daniel had always been a morning person. He liked the stillness of dawn, the way the first rays of sunlight slipped through the cracks in his shop's window. It was when he wrote best, when the city was still waking up. So when someone knocked on his door before sunrise, he wasn't expecting it. He opened it to find Lily Moore standing there, out of breath, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. "Daniel," she gasped, "you need to see this." She shoved the phone into his hands, and there, playing on the screen, was Layla Carter on stage singing his song in front of thousands. Daniel's breath caught. He watched as the audience swayed together as the world's biggest pop star poured her heart into the words he had written. The comments below the video were a blur, but he caught snippets. "Where can I find more of his music? This song feels like home. I don't even know who Daniel Cruz is, but I'm crying." He looked up at Lily, his voice quiet. "What's happening?" Lily laughed, shaking her head in disbelief. "You just went viral, Daniel, and not just viral. Your song is changing the industry." For a long moment, Daniel didn't say anything. Then, finally, he exhaled. "Well," he murmured, looking down at his old guitar, "I guess it was just waiting for the right time to be heard." By the time the sun had fully risen over New Orleans, the pressure on Pulse Records was at an all-time high. Streaming platforms were calling. TV networks wanted interviews. And most importantly, record labels around the world were trying to sign Daniel. But Daniel Cruz wasn't interested in money. He wasn't interested in fame. He was interested in the music. And for the first time in his life, the world was finally listening. The night of the Pulse Records annual music summit was supposed to be a celebration of the industry's biggest successes. Instead, it was about to become the scene of Ethan Blackwell's reckoning. The event was held in a grand ballroom in Los Angeles, filled with the who's who of the music industry. Artists, producers, executives, and reporters gathered in their finest attire, sipping champagne under massive chandeliers. And at the very center of it all, standing behind the podium like a king addressing his court, was Ethan Blackwell. He adjusted his expensive cufflinks, flashing his trademark smirk at the cameras. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth, confident. "We are witnessing something incredible, something that proves why Pulse Records is at the forefront of the music industry." A massive screen behind him lit up, showing clips of Daniel Cruz's viral song. The crowd murmured in excitement. Everyone had heard about the song that had taken the world by storm, the track that blended the old with the new in a way no one had expected. "When we at Pulse Records discovered Daniel Cruz," Ethan continued, "we knew we had something special. And thanks to our vision, our marketing, and our dedication to pushing boundaries, his music has reached audiences worldwide." Daniel, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the ballroom, tensed, discovered their vision. He hadn't even signed with Pulse Records. Ethan had thrown him out. Daniel clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around his old guitar case. He had expected Ethan to ignore the past, but to rewrite history. That was something else entirely. And then, just as the applause started to build, a voice cut through the noise. "That's a fascinating story, Ethan. Too bad it's not the truth." The room fell into silence, and then, from the back of the ballroom, Margaret Blackwell stepped forward. Ethan froze, his confident smirk flickering for the first time. His mother wasn't supposed to be here. Margaret Blackwell was a legend in the industry. She had founded Pulse Records decades ago, shaping it into one of the most influential labels in the world. But after retiring, she had stepped away from the spotlight, leaving the company in the hands of her son. And now, here she was, walking up to the stage, calm, composed, but with fire in her eyes. She reached the microphone, taking a moment to scan the crowd. "I apologize for the interruption," she said, her voice measured. "But I couldn't let this fabrication continue any longer." She turned toward Ethan, her expression unreadable. You claim Pulse Records discovered Daniel Cruz. Ethan forced a laugh. Of course we did. Why else would his music be so successful? Margaret nodded slowly. Interesting. Because I seem to remember that when Daniel Cruz walked into this very building, you called him an old man playing outdated lullabies and threw him out. The crowd gasped. Ethan's face paled. Margaret turned to the screen behind them. Roll the footage. And suddenly, the truth played for the entire world to see. On screen, Ethan was seen mocking Daniel in the studio, calling his music irrelevant, laughing with his producers. The next clip showed him telling Daniel, "No one will ever listen to your music." And finally, footage surfaced of Daniel walking away with his guitar, Ethan smirking in the background. The silence in the room was deafening. Then the murmurs started, angry, disapproving, disgusted. Ethan swallowed hard. He had been exposed. Margaret let the footage play before stepping back up to the microphone. "You see," she said, addressing the audience, "I never truly retired from Pulse Records. I stepped away, yes, but I never stopped watching." She turned toward Daniel, her eyes warm. "And when I heard Daniel Cruz's music, I saw something that I hadn't seen in a long time, something real, something that had the power to change the industry." She looked back at Ethan. "So I sent him an invitation. I wanted to see if Pulse Records, the company I built, still valued true music. I wanted to see if we still understood that music isn't just about marketability. It's about culture, legacy, heart." She shook her head. "And Ethan, you failed that test." The murmurs grew louder. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. "You didn't just reject Daniel Cruz," Margaret continued. "You have spent years deliberately shutting out traditional music to make room for cheap, manufactured hits. You silenced voices that deserved to be heard, and you did it all for profit." The murmurs turned into outrage. Margaret sighed. "I made a mistake leaving this company in your hands, and now I'm here to correct it." She turned to the audience. "Effective immediately, I am reclaiming control of Pulse Records. And Ethan Blackwell is no longer in charge." The room erupted. Some people clapped. Others gasped. Ethan looked stunned, his mouth opening and closing like he couldn't process what had just happened. Margaret wasn't done. She turned back to Daniel. "And as for you, Mr. Cruz, if you're willing, I would like to offer you a leadership role in a new division at Pulse Records, one dedicated to preserving and evolving traditional music. You won't have to change your sound. You won't have to compromise. We'll bring your music to the world exactly as it was meant to be heard." Daniel stared. For so many years, he had been told that his music had no place in the modern industry. And now, he was being offered a chance to reshape that very industry. Slowly, he stood. He walked toward the stage, passing Ethan, who still looked too stunned to speak. When he reached the microphone, he took a deep breath. "I never wanted fame," he said, his voice steady. "I just wanted to play the music I love, the music of my people, the music that tells our stories." He met Margaret's gaze and nodded. "If this means helping others like me get heard, then yes. I accept." The room exploded into applause, and for the first time in his life, Ethan Blackwell knew what it felt like to be powerless. As Daniel shook Margaret's hand, Ethan sat in the corner of the stage, his head bowed, the weight of his own arrogance crushing him. Because music wasn't just a business. It was a legacy. And Daniel Cruz had just ensured that it would never be lost again. The world had changed. And Daniel Cruz was still sitting in the same old wooden chair in the same small shop, surrounded by the same worn-out guitars, as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. Even though his song had taken over the world, even though his face had been on magazine covers, even though executives from record labels had begged him to sign multi-million-dollar contracts, Daniel Cruz had made his choice. He stayed. He stayed in his small music shop in New Orleans just like he always had. But now, his shop was never empty. There were more students than ever, young and old, from different backgrounds, all wanting to learn from the man who had brought real music back to life. Some came in with old family songs, asking Daniel how they could mix them with modern rhythms. Others came with electric guitars, wanting to add something raw to their melodies. Some just came to listen, hoping to understand what made his music so powerful, and Daniel taught them all. Music isn't about money, he told them. It's not about fame, it's about telling a story that needs to be told. That was all he ever cared about, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't the only one who believed it. Meanwhile, over at Pulse Records, something incredible was happening. With Margaret Blackwell now back in charge, the label had officially launched its most ambitious project yet, a program called Echoes of the Past. The goal? To find, support, and elevate artists who blended traditional music with modern sounds, just like Daniel had done. Within months, the impact was undeniable. In Japan, a young violinist started mixing ancient koto melodies with modern rock. In South Korea, a DJ fused Korean pansori storytelling with electronic dance music. In Brazil, samba musicians began experimenting with African tribal drums and hip-hop beats. The movement spread like wildfire. It was no longer just about Daniel's song. It was about a global revival, a reminder that music has roots, and those roots should never be forgotten. People weren't just listening. They were reconnecting with where they came from. And in the middle of it all, Daniel remained exactly as he was, an old man in a small shop, playing the same guitar he had played since he was a boy. And yet, somehow, the whole world was now playing along with him. One quiet afternoon, as Daniel was tuning a student's guitar, the bell over the shop door jingled softly. He looked up, expecting another eager young musician. But instead he saw Ethan Blackwell. The man looked different. Gone was the polished suit, the cocky smirk, the overwhelming air of superiority. He was dressed simply now, a button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up, no expensive watch in sight. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan cleared his throat, shifting awkwardly. "I was in town," he said. "Thought I'd stop by." Daniel simply nodded. Ethan looked around the shop, the same shop he had once considered worthless, the same instruments he had once mocked. "It's funny," he muttered. "You never changed anything." Daniel smiled, plucking a quiet note from his guitar. "Why would I?" Ethan hesitated. "I was wrong." His voice was quieter now, about a lot of things. Daniel didn't say anything. He just let the words hang in the air. After a moment, Ethan took a deep breath. "Do you think you could teach me?" Daniel studied him for a long moment. Then, without a word, he reached for an old guitar sitting by the counter and handed it to Ethan. Ethan hesitated, then took it. His fingers, once only familiar with profit margins and corporate deals, now traced the worn frets like he was discovering something for the first time. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Blackwell was ready to listen. That night, after the shop had closed and the city had quieted down, Daniel sat outside on his tiny wooden porch, staring up at the stars. A gentle breeze carried the sounds of distant street musicians through the air. He reached for his old notebook, the one he had filled with unfinished lyrics and old memories, and began to write. "Dear grandfather, I wish you could see this. The world is listening now. The music we thought would fade away, it's everywhere. In the hands of young musicians, in the voices of people who never knew they needed it. They're carrying it forward in ways I never imagined. It was never about being famous, never about being rich. It was always about keeping the music alive. And now it is, because true music never dies. It just waits for the right time to be heard." Daniel closed the notebook, smiling to himself. Then, as if carried by the wind, a melody drifted through the streets, a street performer playing a familiar tune. His tune, But this time it wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to everyone, and that was all he had ever wanted.